I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, The Gospel According to John, an encounter with grace and truth. Today we'll be talking about lesson 21 of our study, which covers the Gospel according to John, chapter 18, verses 1 through 27. Now we're moving on from this section of talking that we've had where Jesus has been laying the foundation for the church. Not only are we moving on in terms of tone of the gospel, but in kind of typical form, we've talked a little bit about this sort of being, the gospel according to John being at the very least inspired by Greek drama. We actually have a physical moving on as well in terms of a change of scene. So Jesus and his followers we see move to this garden. This garden is a place that it's not unusual for them to go here. Which means that Judas also knows that they're going there. What's significant about that? Again, Jesus is being very deliberate in terms of what's happening here. Judas knows where Jesus is going. Jesus knows that Judas knows that and still goes there. He is not trying to avoid getting caught. He is, in fact, specifically and explicitly going to the place where he is likely to be caught, knowing that he's going to be caught. There's also imagery around a garden. There's, of course, a very famous thing that happens in the Bible in a garden at the very beginning. Humanity fell in a garden. Here we're going to be kickstarting the salvation of humanity in this garden, the series of events that leads directly to it. So that's not uninteresting. I don't think it's like the most critical key thing to John's gospel and version of this, but it's definitely kind of an interesting parallel. Note that the text has not told us exactly when this is. We're in Holy Week, but we don't know when yet. We're going to solve that here before very long. But at this point, we just know scene change. We don't know time, just the spatial location where they are. And in fact, we only vaguely know the location. We know a garden. In John's Gospel, it's not named. It's not the Garden of Gethsemane. It's not, you can point to it on a map. It's specifically here. It's a garden in vaguely this region that Jesus and his followers were accustomed to going to. So to John, the specific location of the garden is less significant than the garden. And so far, the timing of this is also not that important. It all will be, but as the more particular things become important, John will tell them to us. And then we should stop and think, why is that specific thing here? And what does it mean? So for now, and we will talk a little bit more about what does it mean that all this is happening in the garden as some of it unfolds, because that is our setup. Here we are. And of course, with the view of an audience, we know that this is the kickstart of the Passion, and we know where this goes from here. But we're into it now. So let's see how that unfolds. So, setting the scene. Jesus and his followers are in this unnamed garden that is just outside of Jerusalem. Now we cut to Judas, who we know is going to betray Jesus. In this gospel, we skip all of the back and forth between Judas and the Jewish leaders, where they entice him into betraying Jesus, and where they pay him. And we just fast forward here to Judas is with this group of people, thugs. Who is all in the band of thugs? We definitely have some Jews. Some of the Jewish leaders are here with Judas. By and large, the soldiers are Roman. We have more Roman presence in Jerusalem right now than you would have had most time of the year. There as peacekeepers. Remember, this is all happening within the backdrop of first the Feast of Passover and then the longer Feast of Unleavened Bread, for which people came up to Jerusalem. So with an expected huge influx of people, you also have an influx of essentially law enforcement to help keep the peace. And we still do that now, right? You don't have a concert without having security there. Because people in large groups can have problems, and if they come up, you need some way to handle it, or it gets way out of control. So, of course, there's much greater Roman presence here in Jerusalem than there normally would be. In fact, it's extraordinarily likely that Pilate wouldn't have normally even been in Rome, or in Jerusalem, but is here because of the feast day. So everything that is happening in terms of Rome's involvement is facilitated by the fact that this is a major feast, and otherwise might not have been able to happen the way that it was. But because it is that way, and that also helps explain, these Jewish leaders haven't been able to catch Jesus on their own and haven't felt comfortable doing it. When they go to catch him, who do they have primarily as the muscle to catch him? Romans. Why? Certainly they have their own thugs that they could have used. Then they certainly do. There continues to be a very complex political situation for them to navigate. They don't like Jesus. They want to kill Jesus. The crowd does like Jesus. They want to crown Jesus. The Jewish leaders can't just kill him without losing the support of the crowd and their power and position along with it. But if they keep him, they could lose the support of the crowd and their power and position along with it. They are in a very weak position for the people who in theory have all of the power. And so what they're trying to find is a way out of this where Jesus goes away and they don't get blamed. And everything that we see them do in the next couple of chapters is going to be them trying to maneuver things in such a way where Jesus goes away and they can blame the Romans. Everybody already hates the Romans. They do too. They're not going to lose any support by continuing to fuel hatred against Rome. That ultimately doesn't work out so well, but it's way after Jesus' time that the Roman hatred boils over and leads to calling down a little too much attention and Rome stepping in to deal with it. That ultimately doesn't end very well, but that's well past the time of Jesus that gets out of control. For now, it's a great idea. So we're going to come capture Jesus at night. We're not going to send just the Jewish guard. We're going to send Romans to do it. Specifically because if anybody then later is asking about what happened to Jesus, it's the Romans grabbed him, not we grabbed him. We'll keep seeing what develops along those lines, but that ends up being a very important thing. It also shows us something about the politics and how some of these things work, that Jewish leaders are in charge of Roman soldiers. Obviously, Pilate ultimately has say, but because they're here as peacekeepers, as a general rule, they are working with and in collaboration with the Jewish leaders as well. At this point, at least in theory, all of the leaders are on the same team. We'll see how that develops as well. So, Roman soldiers have come out with Jewish leadership to grab Jesus. And Judas is there as well. We see a few other things here that become relevant. We know, at least contextually, when this is happening. Not down to the minute or the hour, but we know the general time of day. How do we know? What do these soldiers have with them? They have torches and lanterns, which means it's midday. No, it means they're coming at night. Why would you engage in a military action at night? What is it that you're trying to do with that? You are trying not to announce or to draw a bunch of notice, which is a relevant point here as we watch how the politics of this situation develop and what it means. They didn't grab Jesus in the middle of the day, he's going to be, again, publicly, very publicly in Jerusalem in the midst of feasting and all of that. They could have grabbed him at any point in Jerusalem, and they still don't feel comfortable doing that, even if they get the Romans to be the ones doing that. They're still here at night. We also see this brief exchange, or the first part of this exchange, between Jesus and the soldiers. So the soldiers are coming. Jesus, importantly, steps out first to meet them, which prevents any kind of conflict as they're trying to find Jesus. It makes sure that all of his followers stay safe. He goes out first. And though he, of course, and the text tells us he knows everything that's about to happen, he could definitely still be running away. That's not what he does. He goes out directly to meet them, and he asks them the question that he seems to be most fond of asking people. The first question he asks anyone in the gospel, or a slightly different version of it. Whom do you seek? He asks them. And they say, Jesus, and he says, I am. The translation here has, I am he, which is a fair translation of it, but also a fair translation is, I am, the name of God. Here he's not on trial, and there's no real public record. We'll see he gets a little dodgier when it comes to how he responds and anything that looks like it could be on any kind of record. But here it's not at all accidental that his response is the name of God. Who are you looking for? Jesus. I am is a better identifier of him than saying I am Jesus, which he could say. It's framing his identification here as not just Jesus, but as God. And that will be an important thing for us to continue to take with us through this whole encounter as well. Jesus is very deliberately going about all of this with all of the power of God, chooses to do it the way that he's doing it. Here we have something that I'm not sure gets enough credit for how odd it is. And I don't 100% understand all the logistics of what's going on here, and John kind of brushes over it a little bit. It's fascinating, though, and there are a few different ways we can look at it, and there are probably ways that I haven't thought of that we can look at it as well. So I'm just going to kind of throw a bunch of stuff out there for this one, and then we can all make of it what we will. The relevant points here. Jesus has gone out to meet these guards who have come to arrest him. He asked, who are you looking for? They said Jesus. He said, I am. Then what happens? Imagine what should happen. What do you think happens? You're a thug. You're there to arrest a guy. He asks you who you're looking for. You say him, and he says, yep, I'm the guy. What do? You grab him, right? You arrest him. That's what you're there for. That's your job. That's what should happen, you would think. What does happen? Instead of closing in, they fall back and fall to the ground. One of the ways that I've heard people look at this, and before I started reading it a little more carefully, I just assumed was the deal, is that name of God is very sacred, right? And they could be alarmed, mock, or otherwise that somebody actually said it out loud. And that definitely is possible. But most of these guys are Romans, and they're not really religiously inclined to respect the sanctity of that name. So that doesn't quite seem entirely likely to me. There's a little bit of another precedent from the prophets. Things go down a little bit differently and much more violently, but it's not entirely dissimilar, which is you have a Elijah the prophet up on a hill, and you have the king send people to grab him. Waves and waves of people. And he calls down fire from heaven, and they're all burned up. Not exactly the same deal, but it is kind of the same exchange in terms of they come, they find the guy they're looking for, and then it doesn't exactly go the way they plan. Something about the name of Jesus, the two things that could happen is this could be of their volition and by their power that they're doing this, or it could be by Jesus's, right? It could be that name and what Jesus is doing comes with enough power that it pushes them back, or it could be they choose to back off and basically fall down, prostrate themselves before this guy that they then proceed to arrest, or some other power could do it. The text really doesn't make that abundantly clear to us exactly why. And it doesn't come into play again. It does sort of seem to suggest Jesus by himself has the power to stop all of these guys from arresting him. And personally, I think that's what it's here for. Is they're coming to grab him, they find him, they're ready to get him. They cannot still, without his consent, grab him. They just can't get to him, even with just lone Jesus, without his consent to do so. Which is kind of what you would expect, if you're trying to grab God against his will. And then a second time, when they've been thrown back by whatever means, Jesus again says, "Who are you looking for?" Like nothing happened. And it's almost, well, we'll see, but it's almost like that snaps him back on track and gets everything going again. But there's this hiccup. The first time what should happen isn't what happens. And that is, and John is not accidental about anything that he does here in this gospel. He also doesn't explain to us in great detail the significance of what happens here. So there's some need to extrapolate and interpret for ourselves. Personally, to me, it sounds kind of like it's the power of Jesus demonstrating again to everyone involved that they have absolutely no power over him. And then he essentially, by asking again, whom do you seek, gives them permission to move forward and lets things set into motion back the way that they were going to. Interestingly here, so as Jesus is basically saying, game on, note he doesn't say his name again. He says, "I told you that I am," instead of again saying, "I am." Like, the difference in statement is almost like by not saying these magic, divine, powerful words that kept everybody away. Instead he's saying, "I told you that." And almost like indirectly saying it keeps the effect from happening. And then he places a condition on it. So you guys know I'm not kidding, because something weird just happened here. I'll go fine. I consent to go peacefully. Note that they're not grabbing him forcefully and against his will in this account. He's saying, "Here are my terms and I'll come along with you. Let all these guys go." The strong sense of this is they're there to capture Jesus, but he willingly goes with them. They don't take him against his will. And he is setting terms of his surrender. That usually doesn't happen when the captors are in the stronger position. This whole thing that just happened prior with them, with his name and them backing off, clearly whatever it was helped to establish Jesus as the one in position of strength. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we look at later how the Roman soldiers treat Jesus. Because here, they have been kind of bullied by him when they're not really used to that, and they should have been in a more powerful position. which could lead them to later, when they feel like they have a position of power over Jesus, missing that, again, it's still more of him just consenting to go harder than they otherwise would have. It explains some of the hostility if they felt both confused about this and powerless here. Then later, given any chance, they're going to try to reassert a sense of power. It explains, I mean, it's easy to say, oh, professional soldiers, they're just jerks and they enjoy inflicting misery, and that may be true. But in John's Gospel, at least, there's a thing that happens here that helps explain that. But for now, at least, Jesus is in a position of power, and he uses that to set terms. Jesus has just negotiated the terms of his surrender that included letting his followers go. So what does Peter do? Peter then chooses that moment to go on the attack, to draw his sword, and to go for presumably whoever is closest. This is not a thing that's well thought through, right? He's responding, he's reacting. It will matter. Because later there's going to be a conversation between Jesus and Pilate, and a part of that conversation is going to be, if Jesus had followers of his kingdom, they would be fighting to prevent him from being handed over. And there's going to be an implication that nobody is, that nobody really is a member of Jesus' kingdom or recognizes Jesus' reign. So when we're thinking about that, one guy, and only one, does exactly what Jesus later says, this is what you do if you belong to my kingdom, whatever that is. This is the thing that you would be doing, is you'd be fighting to save me. Also note, when Jesus says, Peter, put your sword away, he's not saying, I don't condone this defense necessarily, right? It's not really chastising in John's Gospel. It's more along the lines of, you saw me surrender. We're embracing this. We're doing this by choice. I am choosing this thing. Yes, this is not going to be pleasant, but you as my follower should follow me in doing this because I am willing it. They're not in charge. I, Jesus, am in charge, and I am choosing this. So Peter, yes, fight for me, Peter, but don't fight here, because what's happening is what I want to be happening. It's a really important distinction that Jesus is in no way, shape, or form saying, don't fight for me. He is instead saying, don't fight here, because in this case, the interests of me, Jesus, and of my captors, these Romans and Jews, are aligned. It's just such an odd thing to think about, that the people capturing Jesus and intending him harm, and Jesus could be intending the same thing for very different reasons. But that is where we are. And for this brief period of time, a lot of interests are going to align for very different purposes in mutual agreement that Jesus needs to die. Jesus will agree with that. The Romans will agree with that, and the Jews will agree with that. There's going to be a brief period of time where all of these conflicting interests align and agree that this thing has to happen, but for very different reasons. And that conflict between different reasons will play out very dramatically before it happens that Jesus dies. Between Jesus, the Jews, and Pilate. and we'll see all of the conflicting motivations and desires here leading inevitably toward the same outcome. And it's fascinating to watch. And ultimately, for a brief period of time, they will all come into perfect alignment. Interestingly, not every interest of every person, every character here does align. Simon Peter demonstrates, even though he is in theory on Jesus' team, he is not aligned with the idea of Jesus dying horribly. He does not want that to happen, and seems on the surface willing to fight and to sacrifice to keep that from happening. He wants to protect this guy that he has been following. Jesus here tries to get him. How could you possibly get someone on board with the idea that you want this thing that's about to happen, right? It's not that Peter is not on Jesus' team. It's that Peter, at this point, cannot imagine that Jesus' team is for what's happening, right? Even if Jesus seems to be, how could you get your head around this? It would seem so odd that Jesus is turning himself in, basically. And you don't want that. And for a little while, Peter is on Team Peter instead of Team Jesus, right? He's missed what Jesus is doing and has fallen back into what he thinks Jesus should be doing. And that leads him where he goes, right? It leads him to do this. It leads him to try to defend them. And it will lead to this next thing he does with trying to follow Jesus as well. And it will lead to how he responds to the pressures of that as well. He's on Team Peter and not on Team Jesus right now. And that leads to the breakdown in understanding that leads to the breakdown in follow-through. But it's because he's not actually serving Jesus' will, he's serving Peter's will. He will later learn what it really means to serve Jesus' will. And interestingly, the sacrifice Jesus is asking of Peter is not Peter sacrificing right now Peter's life. It's Peter sacrificing the deeper sense of who Peter himself is and how he thinks things should be in surrender to who Jesus is. And that is a sacrifice we're all asked to make. We have to do away with our conception of who Jesus, we think Jesus should be, in order to find Jesus as he is. And sometimes Jesus' idea of how things are going to go down is, or should go down, is way different than we think that is, or should be. And we have to learn to let Jesus take the lead and not try to steer him back in the way that we think he should go. Following the theme, or some of the setup here, remember it is nighttime, where they have taken Jesus outside of, hours when normal municipal functions would be occurring. And all of the Jewish part now of this interrogating and trial of Jesus happens at night in secret. This is not a formal trial. Jesus doesn't get from the Jews any formal trial, period, in the Gospel according to John. This is an inquiry, and then we'll see he's turned over to Rome. So setting the stage here, he's not even initially taken to anyone who currently has actual authority in office. He's taken to Annas, who did, and who's related to Caiaphas through marriage. But he's not a judge. He doesn't have a legal position. He's highly ranked and has had positions and is a very influential guy in the camp of people who are not interested in having Jesus around. But they're not taking Jesus to somebody who's actually has any formal authority to conduct any kind of trial here. This is all covert. This is all in the dark, outside of the channels that something like... Normally you catch a criminal, you should turn them over for a trial, right? That's not what's happening. So it's important to note that's not what's happening. and we'll emphasize that further. They're eventually going to have to take this illegitimate proceeding and make it a legitimate proceeding before they can kill Jesus. So they're starting through these illegitimate channels. The Jewish challenge in their goal of killing Jesus is going to be to legitimize enough of a case against him somehow to manage to put him to death and to keep from themselves taking the blame for that. They're not doing it as a public trial, not necessarily because they think they can't trump up charges and make it work, but because they don't want the backlash from the crowd for that. So they're trying to go through back channels here, and they're going to try to get put on Rome the guilt and the negative opinion involved with killing Jesus, which is why they're not, part of why they're not initially doing this themselves through the proper channels. So that will be an important background thing here. But for now, we're just setting that up as Jesus is being dragged to see Annas at night. And a couple of Jesus' disciples have followed. Two out of the group have decided they want to follow. Not necessarily overwhelmingly clear what they think it is they're going to do. They might not have thought of that themselves, right? It might have just been, I have to follow him. I have to see what's going on. And that's Peter and somebody else who's not named here, but ultimately we know that it's John. So Peter and John end up going along. Peter has no way in. John is connected in a way that he is known to the Jewish leaders well enough that he just walks in through the door and everybody lets him in. And they let him come back and say, this guy's with me, he should come in too. And he's also so well connected that when people start wondering, Peter, we saw how you came in and how you came here. Does that mean you were with Jesus? That seems like a problem for Peter. It doesn't seem like John is at all concerned about that or has any concern, any fear of any reprisal against himself for having associated with Jesus. It's an odd thing that definitely has been used as a clue and speculation about John's background. It sure looks like he is fairly closely related to a fairly high level of power, probably among the Jews or possibly among the Romans, but probably the Jews, because this is back alley meeting, basically, if they're not going to let in somebody close with the Romans either. It seems like he is from a very well-connected family. And this exact thing is the main foundation for why people think that about John. And it makes sense. Peter, enjoying no such connections, is very much like a fish out of water in this environment. John gets to go inside to see what's happening. Peter has to wait outside in the courtyard and hang around with the help. And because it's cold, everybody is kind of trying to stay warm, which means they're sort of congregating. But before they even get to Peter's inside and trying to congregate, as he's at the door, already there's a question, weren't you with this Jesus guy? And already he says, no, that's not me. We talked about it a little bit in the last question, but Jesus has said, Peter, you're going to deny me. Of course, Peter's thinking, no way. I would never deny. And it's going to be 3 times. First one on the way in, he says, oh no, I don't know that guy. Why? So he can get in, right? He feels like if he says, I'm with Jesus, they're not going to let him in. What we see here is a progressive situation where little compromise leads to little compromise, leads to little compromise. he's worried about being able to get in, so he says what he needs to say to get in the door. John doesn't have to do that. He's better placed, better known, which leads to more and more blatant and less justifiable denials that we'll see presently. The slope is very slippery. And how does all of that come to pass? It's because Peter is serving Peter's agenda here, not Jesus' agenda. If Peter were all the way on serving Jesus' agenda, he'd say, yes, I know the guy, I'm here for him, and he wants me to do whatever things and face whatever consequences. But this is, at this point, more to Peter about Peter than it is about Jesus. Even if that's not how he sees it, that is functionally how it is. And that leads to the ability to compromise. And we do the same thing. When our service of Jesus can take a form where it's still more about us than it is about Jesus. Even if Jesus is what we're saying and what we seem to be doing, it can still be more about us than about Jesus. And when that happens, those little compromises can happen that over time can add up and add up and add up and lead us very, very far from where Jesus actually is. Now we get to the high priest questioning Jesus. Again, not in a formal trial, and not even in the high priest's residence. This is happening illicitly and in secret, which importantly colors the whole exchange. Now we also see the beginning of Jesus getting way more cryptic, and we'll say that way. He's been, to his disciples, talking very frankly about many things. He has no such inclination when it comes to those who are seeking to kill him. Even though, again, their interests are aligned along the idea that Jesus should die and that he should be put to death by them. It's actually an awkward spot for Jesus because he wants them to kill him. Their case is built on lies, and he won't lie. And he still wants the same outcome that they do. Which, if it weren't for the horrible way that it ends, is kind of a hilarious thing to watch play out. Because they're trying to say, Jesus, is this thing that's incriminating of you true? And he says, and he can't say, yeah, I'm totally guilty of that, because he's not actually guilty of anything. So, but he doesn't also necessarily want to deny any of these things. And there are certain things we'll see more also, he just can't say or agree to because they're not true. And other things he won't say and agree to because he doesn't want to be as clear about who he is with these guys as he was with his followers. So, because they don't deserve to know. And it's not really his place to reveal the things of heaven to these people. So Jesus is in a very tricky place in terms of what it is that he's trying to say, to not incriminate himself and to end up being killed for criminal behavior. Nowhere in John's Gospel will Jesus ever be found guilty of a crime. He will be killed for one, but he will not be found guilty of one. What an odd line to walk. And John seems to think it's very important that he comes across that way. In some of the synoptic Gospels, he's ultimately convicted of a trumped-up crime with false witnesses and all of that. John, who, according to this account, is the only one who was there, says that's not what happened, which is, again, just fascinating. So, how does this work? The high priest is asking Jesus about what he said, and he says, well, find some other people to tell you. What they're trying to find is claims that Jesus is either a king or God within this context, enough that they can... The king would be great, turn him over to Rome. God would be, we'll see, fine, they can work with that. But they need him to say something not only probably that bears guilt, but they're trying to stir up the people around it as well, either the Romans or the Jews, enough that they can sway opinions of either the crowd enough that they can kill Jesus without the crowd being displeased, or the Romans enough that they can get the Romans to kill Jesus so it doesn't matter what the crowd thinks. In either case, they need Jesus to... What they're going for is getting Jesus to incriminate himself, to say something that falls into either of those traps. So they're trying to get him to bear witness to himself now. And he won't. He says, what I have to say about myself is what I've always had to say about myself. Go find all the people who heard it and ask them what I said. Because my story has not changed, which is pretty accurate. It also raises the point, so why now, right? In a secret court saying, I'm not doing anything different now than I always have been, reminder, you haven't been willing to grab me ever then, is for sure antagonizing your captors. In terms of power dynamics, Jesus is still very much acting like he believes he has all the power. The Jews also seem to believe they have a lot of the power. Pilate will believe that he has all of the power. And that power dynamic is also going to be important to trace as we move forward and will be in play as well. And the Romans are, the soldiers are more than happy to strike Jesus when he seems like he's being a little bit mouthy as well. But his point, again, is, what did I say wrong? In general, you want to convict me, find someone who can agree, like the law requires, witnesses, that I have said a thing that is punishable via capital punishment. It's not sufficient for me. I'm not going to incriminate myself right now. Find evidence. Let's do this. Find your two witnesses. Find your evidence that I have committed any crime, and then feel free to convict me. Again, Jesus has to get them to kill him, and he has to not actually be convicted of the crime. So he's not speaking now, because if he now said, I am God, they would convict him of blasphemy, they would have a crime, and they would kill him. It's not false, but they wouldn't know that. How could anyone demonstrate that? They would actually be somewhat justified in convicting him of blasphemy, because how can anyone comprehend the idea that this guy walking around among you is God, especially monotheists? That's like the thing. I am the Lord your God, right? And one God was a big deal to them. And Jesus is not quite claiming to be that God, so it seems like, well, much work has been put into the Trinitarian idea for us to all adjust to this reality of the divinity that is so foreign to human understanding. He's not going to be able to draw a triangle and say, listen guys, I can be God and God can still be Father and Spirit and it can all still be one God, and let me explain to you 2,000 years worth of additional theology so that you can understand that I'm not a blasphemer. Right? They definitely, if he had said, I am God, would have convicted him for blaspheming. The king conversation we will have, and it's also fascinating. But the God one he is not falling into. And that's more along the lines of where his claim has been than king. He's never claiming to be Messiah or king in the way that they're looking for it. Because of how everyone's looking for it, he's avoided most of that terminology and most of those associations. Not entirely. He rode into town on the donkey. He is the king they're looking for, and he's not saying he's not. He's just not going out of his way to associate himself with it. He has identified himself to these guys with the divinity. We've seen it happen. before Abraham was, I am, would be the really potent line. That's what they're trying to get him to do again. And if they can, then they have enough people around that they've got it. And they've got him if that happens. Instead he's saying, find your witnesses. And they're not interested in playing that game because this isn't a trial, right? To go through all of that, they would have to legitimize this proceeding, which they're not interested in doing. So, just so interesting how all of this plays out. That's where we're at right now. As we wind out then, we see the conclusion of Peter's part in what happens before the resurrection, which will be the completion of his cycle of denial. We've talked about that quite a bit already. Slippery slope, well-intentioned, but still thinking more about Peter than about Jesus, and how that kind of leads him the wrong way. We know that Jesus saw it coming and doesn't overly blame or hold this against Peter as well, which ultimately will be a great comfort to to Peter. So there's not a lot more to be said about that. The other thing that happens, though, is in this exchange of different parties and different powers, what it means is Jesus functionally ends up alone. Everybody who would be in his camp in terms of his followers is really not around during everything that happens. John, we know, has access, but then we don't hear from him until all of these legal things play out. We see him again at the foot of the cross. But even John will be absent from any of these conversations and exchanges. Jesus will be alone in terms of representing his point of view. Whereas everybody, so it'll be Jesus, Jewish leaders, and we'll pull in Pilate here in our next lesson as well. And we're going to have, again, 3 different camps, 3 different agendas, motivations, that will all come to agree and align with this idea that Jesus needs to die. This has been an overview of Lesson 21 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, The Gospel According to John, an encounter with grace and truth. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.